There is a restless kind of boredom that settles over a small town on a warm fall afternoon, the kind that makes even the most ordinary kids start eyeing the shadows for something, anything, to make the day feel alive. That was exactly the mood hanging over Greg Banks and his three best friends as they stood in his driveway, kicking gravel and wondering what to do with themselves. "There is nothing to do in Pitt's Landing," Michael Warner announced, his hands buried in the pockets of his faded denim cutoffs. Greg agreed without missing a beat. "Pitt's Landing is the pits." That was the unofficial slogan the four of them had coined for their hometown, even though, if anyone was being honest, it was a perfectly decent little place with quiet streets, shady lawns, and comfortable old houses. But decent and exciting are two very different things when you are a kid with an afternoon to burn. The group had been close for years. Greg and Shari Walker lived next door to each other, their parents woven together as best friends. Bert and Michael lived just a block away. They knew each other the way only kids who have grown up together can know each other, every habit, every joke, every nervous laugh. Duck Arthur, whom everyone called Bert, suggested they wander over to Grover's store to look at the new comic books. He was hoping the new X-Force had arrived. Bert had earned his nickname honestly. He was all long skinny legs and stork-like steps, with small bird-like brown eyes and a nose that curved like a beak under a thick, never-brushed tuft of brown hair. He didn't love the nickname, but he had long since made his peace with it. "We don't have any money," Greg reminded him. "We can still look," Bert insisted. But Shari was already laughing and puffing out her cheeks, doing a spot-on impression of gruff old Grover. "Are you paying or staying?" she growled, and the group cracked up. Greg was the natural athlete among them, broad, shouldered and blond, with flashing green eyes that caught the light when he smiled. He had missed signing up for Bert's new fall little league because his older brother Terry had forgotten to take him. Terry, it turned out, was now working afternoons at the Dairy Freeze. Michael's eyes lit up at the mention of free ice cream cones, but Greg quickly deflated that hope. Terry was, as Greg put it, a straight arrow. Free cones meant empty cones. Michael, round-faced and freckled with short red hair, kept tossing gravel ideas into the air that fell flat just as fast. His jokes had a way of landing in silence. He suggested baseball at the playground. Shari pointed out you cannot really play baseball with four people. Michael suggested they might find other kids there. No one moved. Shari, who wore an oversized yellow sweatshirt over bright green leggings and whose hobby was giving Bert a hard time, finally decided she was done standing around talking about being bored. She stepped onto the curb and began walking it like a tightrope, arms out wide, and the boys followed without thinking, all four of them balancing in a row like circus performers in an impromptu game of follow the leader. A cocker spaniel came bursting out of a neighbor's hedge, yapping like mad, tail going like a tiny propeller. Shari stopped to pet it. The dog licked her hand a few times, and then, having satisfied its curiosity, disappeared back into the hedge. The four friends moved on, past the school, where a couple of guys were shooting baskets, and some little kids were playing kickball. No one they knew. The road curved away from the school and carried them past familiar houses until, just beyond a small wooded stretch, they all stopped at the same moment and looked up a sloping lawn that nobody had cut in weeks. Tall weeds poked out everywhere. The shrubs had gone wild, and at the top of that slope, nearly swallowed by the shadows of enormous old oak trees, sat a house that had once been something to look at. It was grey shingled and 3 stories tall, with a wraparound screened porch, a sloping red roof, and tall chimneys rising from either end. But the broken windows on the second floor, the cracked and weather-stained shingles, the shutters hanging loose beside dust-smeared glass, all of it told the story of a place long abandoned. The mailbox at the front walk leaned on its broken pole, with one word painted on it, Kaufman. Everyone in Pitt's Landing knew the Kaufman house, and everyone in Pitt's Landing had heard the stories, ghost stories, wild tales about murders and ghastly things that had supposedly happened inside those walls. Most likely none of them were true, but the house had been deserted for as long as Greg and his friends could remember, and something about it had always made people look away. Michael did not look away. "Hey, I know what we can do for excitement," he said, and before anyone could respond, he had already started up through the weeds toward the front of the house. "Are you crazy?" Greg called after him, but his feet were already moving to catch up. Michael's blue eyes caught a sliver of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the oak trees. "We wanted an adventure," he said simply. "Something a little exciting, right? Come on, let's check it out." Greg stopped and stared up at the house. A cold chill moved down his back, slow and certain. And then, before he could say a single word, a dark shape exploded out of the shadows of the tall weeds and launched itself straight at him. Greg toppled backward onto the ground and let out a yelp of pure terror. But the laughter that followed told him everything he needed to know. It was only a cocker spaniel, the dumb neighborhood dog, wagging its stubby tail at the curb, like it had just pulled off the greatest joke in history. Embarrassed, Greg pulled himself to his feet and braced for the teasing. But his friends had already moved on. Their eyes were drifting up to the Kaufman house, that neglected old wreck of a place, sitting heavy and dark at the top of the broken concrete steps. And something in the way they looked at it told Greg that this afternoon was about to go sideways. Bird slapped Michael hard on the back, hard enough to make him wince and spin around ready to swing, and declared that they were going in. Michael agreed immediately. Shari was already nodding, and Greg, the sensible one, the one who always ended up playing that thankless role, tried to pump the brakes. He said the place was creepy. He said he did not think they should go in there, and for his trouble he got a chorus of clucking. Bird tucked his hands into his armpits and flapped his arms, his beady eyes and beaky nose completing the picture so perfectly that Greg could not help but laugh. He never could resist Bird. The argument, such as it was, died right there, at the foot of those broken steps. Shari pointed out the broken window beside the front door, reached in without hesitation, and unlocked it. The heavy wooden door swung open, and one by one they stepped inside. Greg came last, reluctant to the end. Inside, the house was dim and hushed. Thin beams of sunlight pushed through the thick trees out front and fell in pale circles on the worn brown carpet. The floorboards groaned underfoot as they moved past the bare living room, where a couple of overturned grocery store cartons sat against one wall. Spidey's furniture, Greg thought grimly. Spidey was what the kids called a strange man, 50 or 60 years old, who dressed entirely in black and moved through town on long, spindly legs. He looked exactly like a spider. Nobody knew where he came from or where he lived, but plenty of kids had seen him lurking around the Kaufman house. Greg had already brought up Spidey as a reason to leave, and nobody had listened to that either. Both Greg and Bird noticed the dark oval stain in the center of the living room carpet at the same time. Bird wondered aloud if it was blood, his tiny eyes lighting up at the thought. Greg told him it was probably ketchup. Bird laughed and slapped him on the back. In the kitchen, Shari and Michael had gone still. 2 fat grey mice were standing on the dust-covered counter, staring right back at them. Shari called them cute, said they looked like cartoon mice. The sound of her voice sent the rodents scampering around the sink and out of sight. Michael insisted they were rats. Greg explained patiently that rats have long tails and mice do not. Bird declared they were definitely rats, pushed past everyone, and disappeared toward the front of the house. Shari pulled open a cabinet. Empty, Greg joked that Spidey did not strike him as a gourmet chef. They drifted through the narrow dining room, as bare and dusty as everything else, a low chandelier hanging from the ceiling, so caked with grime it had stopped looking like glass entirely. Greg said it looked like a haunted house. Shari said boo. Then a loud crack split the silence, and Greg jumped. Shari laughed and squeezed his shoulder, telling him that old houses just did things like that, made noises for no reason. Greg said again that they should leave and tried to frame it as boredom rather than fear. Shari told him there was something exciting about being somewhere they were not supposed to be. Greg could not quite argue with that, even if he wanted to. They bumped into Michael in the hallway and realized that Bird was gone. Michael pointed to an open door on the right, the basement. Greg stared down into the darkness below with his friends at his side and called Bird's name. The answer came floating up from somewhere deep in the dark below them. A voice twisted with horror, screaming that something had him, begging for help, crying out that it had him, and would somebody please come. It started with a scream. "It has got me! It has got me!" Bird's terrified cries sent Greg flying down the steep basement stairway, shoving past Shari and Michael, who stood frozen in open-mouthed horror behind him. His heart hammered in his chest as he hit the bottom of the stairs, every muscle locked tight with fear. His eyes swept frantically through the smoky light drifting in from the windows near the ceiling. Bird, and there he was, sitting comfortably, calmly, on an overturned metal trash can, legs crossed, a broad smile stretched across his bird-like face. "Gotcha," he said softly, and then burst out laughing. Shari and Michael clattered down the stairs a moment later, their voices still shaking. "Another dumb joke?" Michael asked. "Bird, were you goofing on us again?" Shari demanded, shaking her head. She only called him Doug when she was truly upset with him, and she was clearly working up to it. Bird just nodded, enjoying every second, wearing that peculiar half-grin of his. "You guys are too easy," he scoffed. But Shari wasn't laughing. She reminded him about the boy who cried wolf. What if something really bad happened one day, and they all assumed it was just another one of his jokes? Bird waved her concern away with a grand gesture around the basement. "What could happen? Look, it is brighter down here than upstairs." And he was right. Sunlight poured down through 4 long ground-level windows, flooding the large cluttered room with light. Greg wasn't convinced. His eyes kept moving, scanning the room. Behind Bird's overturned trash can sat an improvised table made from a sheet of plywood balanced on 4 paint cans. A nearly flat mattress, dirty and stained, rested against the wall with a faded wool blanket folded at its foot. Someone had been living down here, and not so long ago either. Michael spotted the scattered pile of empty television dinner boxes on the floor and immediately dubbed the mysterious occupant Spidey. Bird kicked through the boxes and wondered aloud where Spidey heated his frozen meals. Shari suggested maybe he ate them frozen, like popsicles, and the tension in the room dissolved again into laughter and curiosity. It was Shari who made the real discovery first. She pulled open the doors of a towering oak wardrobe standing against the wall and let out a delighted cry. Inside was a treasure chest, a forgotten fashion. She wrapped a ratty fur coat around her shoulders and twirled. Michael and Bird rushed over and dove in, pulling out wide bell-bottom pants, yellow dress shirts with pleated fronts, tie-dyed neckties nearly a foot wide, bright scarves, and colorful bandanas. Bird draped a fuzzy red bow around his neck and shoulders and announced they were Spidey's dress-up clothes. Shari modeled a bright purple wide-brimmed hat. Michael held up a long blue cape and marveled that the stuff had to be at least 25 years old. Greg hung back, watching his friends with a creeping unease he couldn't shake. "Don't you think maybe those belong to somebody?" he called out. Nobody seemed particularly interested in that question. While the others raided the wardrobe, Greg wandered toward the far end of the basement. A furnace occupied the far wall, its ducts draped in thick cobwebs. Tucked partially behind those ducts, he spotted another set of stairs, probably leading to an outside exit. Wooden shelves lined the adjoining wall, loaded with old paint cans, rags, newspapers, and rusty tools. A wooden work table sat in front of the shelves, and clamped to its edge was a metal vise. Greg reached out and turned the handle, expecting the jaws of the vise to open. Instead, something above the work table moved. A small door popped open, revealing a hidden cabinet shelf that had been built right into the wall, and resting on that shelf waiting in the shadows as if it had been placed there on purpose. What a camera! For a long moment, Greg just stared at the camera. Something told him it was hidden away for a reason. Something told him he should close the secret door and walk away, but he couldn't resist. He reached onto the hidden shelf and took the camera in his hands. It pulled out easily then. To Greg's surprise, the door instantly snapped shut behind him with a loud bang. Weird, he thought, turning it over in his hands. What a strange place to leave a camera. Why would someone put it here? If it were valuable enough to hide in a secret cabinet, why didn't they take it along? Greg examined the camera eagerly. It was large and surprisingly heavy, with a long lens. A telephoto, maybe. Greg was very interested in cameras. He had an inexpensive automatic camera at home, one that took okay snapshots. But he had been saving his allowance in hopes of buying a really good camera with a lot of lenses. He loved poring over camera magazines, studying the different models, picking out the ones he dreamed of owning. Sometimes he imagined himself traveling around the world, climbing mountain tops, following hidden jungle rivers, photographing everything he saw, and becoming a famous photographer. His camera at home was just too crummy. That was why all his pictures came out too dark or too light, and everyone in them had glowing red dots in their eyes. He wondered if this camera was any good. Raising the viewfinder to his eye, he sighted around the room and came to a stop on Michael, who had climbed to the top of the steps wearing 2 bright yellow feather bows and a white Stetson hat, striking a pose like he was born for the spotlight. "Wait, hold it," Greg cried, moving closer and raising the camera. "Let me take your picture, Michael." "Where did you find that?" Bert asked. "Does that thing even have film in it?" Michael demanded. "I don't know," Greg said. "Let's see." Leaning against the railing, Michael struck what he considered a very sophisticated pose. Greg pointed the camera up and focused carefully. It took a short while for his finger to find the shutter button. "Okay, ready, say cheese." "Cheddar," Michael said, grinning down at Greg and holding his pose. "Very funny, Michael's a riot," Bert said sarcastically. Greg centered Michael in the viewfinder frame and pressed the shutter button. The camera clicked and flashed. Then it made an electronic whirring sound. A slot pulled open on the bottom, and a cardboard square slid out. "Hey, it is one of those automatic developing cameras," Greg exclaimed. He pulled the square of cardboard out and examined it. "Look, the picture is starting to develop." "Let me see," Michael called down, leaning forward on the railing. But before he could take a single step, everyone heard a loud crunching sound. They all looked up toward the source of that sound, and what they saw stopped their hearts. The railing broke away, and Michael went sailing over the edge. "No!" Michael screamed as he toppled toward the floor, arms outstretched, the feather bows flying behind him like animal tails. He turned in the air, then hit the concrete hard on his back, his eyes frozen wide in astonishment and fright. He bounced once, then cried out again, "My ankle! Oh, do boo boo! My ankle!" He grabbed at the injured ankle, then quickly let go with a loud gasp. It hurt too much to touch. Still holding the camera and the developing photo, Greg rushed to Michael. Shari and Bird did the same. "We'll go get help," Shari told Michael, who was still on his back, groaning in pain. But then they heard the ceiling creak, footsteps above them. Someone was in the house. Someone was moving toward the basement stairs. They were about to be caught. The footsteps overhead grew louder, and terror did the rest. 4 friends stood frozen in the basement, exchanging frightened glances, each one knowing what the other was thinking. They had to get out. "Now, we've got to get out of here," Shari whispered, her voice barely a breath. But Michael was still on the ground, his injured ankle refusing to cooperate. He pulled himself to a sitting position and looked up at them with wild eyes. "You can't leave me here." Bird told him to stand, and Michael struggled upright, his face twisted with panic. "I can't stand on this foot," he said. Nobody argued, nobody hesitated. Shari and Bird moved in without a word, pulling Michael's arms over their shoulders and taking his weight between them. It was clumsy, it was slow, and the ceiling was still creaking under those heavy footsteps above. Greg scanned the basement and pointed toward the far wall. Behind the furnace, half hidden in shadow, there was another stairway. He told them it probably led out, though he couldn't promise the door at the top wasn't padlocked. "Just pray the door isn't padlocked or something," Greg said. We're praying, Bird declared. Groaning under Michael's weight, Shari pushed forward. "We're out of here," Michael hobbled between them, wincing with every step, leaning heavily on his two friends as they followed Greg through the dark. The stairs behind the furnace led upward to a pair of wooden double doors, set flat at ground level. Greg squinted at them and felt a thin thread of hope. "I don't see a padlock," he said carefully. Then the voice came from behind them, sharp and angry, cutting through the basement like a blade. "Hey, who is down there?" Michael went pale. "It is Spidey." Shari shoved Greg forward. "Hurry, come on." Greg set his camera down on the top step and reached up to grab the handles of the double doors. Spidey's voice came again, louder, closer, and angrier this time. Greg hesitated for just a moment, whispering that the doors might be locked from the outside. "Just push them, man," Bird pleaded. Greg took a deep breath and threw every ounce of strength he had into the doors. They didn't move, not even a shudder, not even a crack of light. He turned back to his friends, and the word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "We're trapped," he told them. There are moments when getting out feels just as dangerous as staying in. And for Greg, Bird, Shari, and Michael, the race to escape the old house was only the beginning of their troubles. With Michael leaning heavily on Bird's shoulder, Greg and Bird threw themselves against the heavy wooden doors. On the count of 3, they pushed with everything they had, and the doors swung open at last. Shari let out a happy cry, and just like that, they were free. The backyard they stumbled into was just as wild and overgrown as the front, with a massive oak limb lying half collapsed to the ground, as if even the trees here had given up. But none of that mattered. What mattered was getting out. Bird and Shari hauled Michael up the steps and onto the grass. They told him to try walking, and to his own surprise he found he could. The ankle was loosening up. Carefully, gingerly, he pushed himself forward, and the 4 of them moved together along the overgrown hedge that lined the side of the yard, staying in its shadow, working their way around to the front of the house. When their feet finally hit the street, Bird let out a whoop of pure relief. But Greg stopped at the curb and turned back. Something made him look up at the living room window, and what he saw sent a cold wire of dread straight through him. A dark figure stood there, hands pressed flat against the glass, perfectly still, just watching them go. Spidey, standing in black, unmoving, staring like something that had stepped out of a nightmare. They did not linger. They ran. By the time they reached Michael's house and collapsed onto the shady front lawn, the mood had shifted from terror to something closer to shaky relief. Michael admitted his ankle barely hurt anymore. Bird teased him about his extra padding softening the fall, and Michael told him to shut up. Shari leaned against a tree and reminded them, with a small smile, that this was exactly the adventure they had gone looking for. But the image of Spidey at the window kept pulling the conversation back to something darker, all dressed in black, staring without blinking. Michael said he looked like a zombie. Greg said something quieter and more serious. He said Spidey had seen them very clearly, and that they would be smart to stay away from that house. Michael pushed back. The house was not Spidey's. He was just squatting there. They could call the police. But Greg thought that through and said there was no way to know what a person like that might do if pushed. Shari, surprisingly, defended Spidey. She said he did not want trouble. He just wanted to be left alone. Michael agreed with her, reasoning that Spidey had only come after them because they were messing with his things. Then Michael straightened up and remembered something. He asked Greg about the picture, the snapshot Greg had taken with the camera, just before everything went wrong. Greg reached into his back pocket and pulled it out. The others crowded around him, leaning in close to get a look at the small square photo. And then Greg went very still. Something was wrong with the picture. He stared at it hard, his voice dropping with confusion, and something that felt very much like fear. And he told them that something was not right. What had the camera captured inside that dark and broken house? And why did it look the way it did? The chapter closes tight on that unresolved moment, leaving four kids huddled on a sunlit lawn, staring at a photograph that seemed to be hiding a secret none of them were ready for. The trouble started with a photograph that should not have existed. There the four friends stood, gathered around Greg, their mouths falling open as they stared at the image in his hand. The camera had caught Michael in midair, suspended between the broken railing and the hard floor below, frozen in the terrible moment of his fall. It was impossible. It was right there in front of them. That is impossible, Shari cried, and Michael snatched the photo away to study it himself, holding it close, tilting it at every angle, as though a different angle might tell him a different story. He remembered it wrong, he insisted. He had been posing. He had a big, goofy smile on his face. He had not been falling. Bird peered over his shoulder and disagreed cheerfully, calling it a great action shot before picking up the camera and complimenting Greg on the fine piece of equipment he had, quote, stolen. Greg tried to correct that particular word, stumbling over his own explanation, while Michael muttered that Bird was not funny and pocketed the photograph with a quiet, unsettled word. Greg glanced at his watch and felt the familiar jolt of being late. He said his goodbyes and jogged home through the lowering afternoon sun, which stretched long shifting shadows across the sidewalk through a cluster of palm trees. He had promised to clean his room and help with vacuuming before dinner, and both of those promises were now behind schedule. What stopped him short in his tracks was the navy blue Taurus station wagon sitting in the driveway, brand new, the dealer sticker still glued to the window. His father had picked up the new car. Greg pulled open the driver's door just to lean in and breathe it in, that particular smell of fresh vinyl and newness that is unlike anything else in the world. He closed the door hard and appreciated the solid, satisfying clunk it made, and then naturally he raised the camera. He wanted to remember it exactly like this. Brand new and perfect. He backed up until the whole profile of the station wagon filled the viewfinder, pressed the shutter, and watched the familiar process unfold. The loud click, the flash, the electronic whir, and the small grey and yellow square sliding out from the bottom. He tucked the camera and the developing snapshot under his arm and ran inside, calling up to his mother that he was home, promising to be right down. His parents were already asking about the car, his mother impatient at the foot of the stairs, and Greg was moving fast, trying to be in two places at once. But first, the camera had to disappear. He could not let his parents see it. The questions would come, and he had no good answers. He remembered a secret compartment hidden inside his headboard, discovered years ago when his parents had bought him a new bedroom set. He shoved the camera inside and pushed the panel closed. He checked himself quickly in the mirror above his dresser, brushed his blonde hair, rubbed a smudge of black soot from his cheek, and turned to go. Then he stopped. The snapshot, where had he put it? He turned back to find it on the bed where he had tossed it, and curiosity pulled him toward it. He wanted to see how it had come out. He picked it up, and then something went wrong in his chest. Oh, no. The words came out low and involuntary, barely a cry at all, as he stood there staring at what the camera had captured. Something about that photograph of the perfectly ordinary, brand new, beautiful family car had shown him something he was not prepared to see. The chapter ends there, with Greg's face pale in the quiet of his room, and the terrible question hanging in the air. What had the camera seen this time? Something was wrong. Greg could feel it in his bones before his mind could even catch up. He held the photograph close to his face, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The blue Taurus station wagon in the photo was destroyed. It looked as if it had been through something terrible, something violent. The windshield was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The metal was twisted and bent in ways that metal should never bend. The driver's side door was completely caved in. The car was totaled, plain and simple. "This is impossible," Greg blurted out, the words escaping him before he could stop them. From somewhere downstairs, his mother's voice floated up to him. "Greg, where are you? We're all hungry, and you are keeping us waiting." "Sorry," he called back, his eyes still locked on the snapshot. "Coming." He shoved the photo deep into his top dresser drawer and forced himself to walk downstairs. But the image followed him. The twisted metal, the caved-in door, the shattered glass. It burned itself into his mind and would not let go. He had to check. He just had to. So he crossed the living room and peeked out the front window toward the driveway. There it was, the station wagon, sitting right where it always sat, sparkling in the warm glow of the setting sun. Shiny, perfect. Not a scratch on it. Greg turned and walked into the dining room, where his brother and his parents were already seated at the table, waiting. "The new wagon is awesome, Dad," he said, doing his best to push the horrible image out of his thoughts. But he could not shake it. The twisted metal kept creeping back. The caved-in door, the shattered windshield. Then his father leaned back in his chair with a happy grin and made his announcement. "After dinner," he said cheerfully, "I am taking you all for a drive in the new car." And Greg sat there, smiling on the outside, while the question no one else at that table could even imagine gnawed at him from the inside. Why did the photograph show a car that had not been destroyed yet? The Banks family sat around the dinner table, and while everything seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface, Greg carried something heavy and invisible on his shoulders, something no one else at the table could see or feel. The meal began with a small comedy. Terry, Greg's brother, chewed his way through dinner with his usual enthusiasm, announcing between mouthfuls that the chicken was great. Mrs. Banks corrected him with dry patience. It was veal, not chicken. Terry's face went red as a stoplight, but he recovered quickly, declaring that it was simply such excellent veal it tasted as good as chicken. Greg and his father laughed. Mrs. Banks wondered aloud why she even bothered to cook. The table settled back into its comfortable rhythm, and Mr. Banks asked Terry about his shift at the dairy freeze. Terry reported that they had run out of vanilla, and people had not been pleased about it, delivering the news while forking an entire potato into his mouth and swallowing it down like it was nothing. But Greg had barely touched his food. Something was eating at him instead. When his father mentioned the evening ride in the new family car, Greg felt the dread rise up in his chest like cold water. He tried to get out of it. He said he had plans to visit Michael. His father told him to call and cancel. He said he was not feeling well, not very hungry, a little tired. His mother's concern was immediate, her eyes scanning his face for fever. Greg assured her there was no temperature, just fatigue. But even as he said the words, they felt hollow and flimsy, and hovering behind every excuse was the truth he could never speak out loud. He had taken a photograph of his friend Michael, and the photo had shown Michael falling. Seconds later, Michael had actually fallen. Then Greg had photographed the brand new car, and the image that developed showed it wrecked and destroyed. Greg did not fully understand what it meant, but the feeling it gave him was unlike anything he had ever felt before. A deep, gnawing dread, a fear without a clean name. Something was wrong with the camera, and whatever that something was, it had a way of reaching forward into the world and making terrible things real. He could not say any of this at the dinner table. It was too strange, too impossible. So he scrambled through his mind for one more excuse, but his father was already watching him with a steady, suspicious eye. There was no more room to maneuver. He had burned through every reason he could invent, and homework on a Saturday night was not going to convince anyone. Mr. Banks settled it simply and firmly. Greg was coming, and that was final. He pointed out that Greg had been looking forward to the new wagon for weeks, and said he genuinely did not understand the problem. Greg admitted to himself that he did not understand it either. He sat with that thought for a moment, turning it over. Was he really going to let a camera, a strange and broken camera, ruin a family outing? Was he going to sit at home paralyzed by a photograph? He tried to push the dread aside. He tried to tell himself he was being silly, and then he forced a smile across his face and told his father he would come, that it sounded great. Whether he believed it or not was another matter entirely. The question the chapter leaves hanging in the cool evening air is a quiet but persistent one. Greg chose to get in that car, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of a wrecked automobile continued to burn. There is a darkness that can sit in the pit of a boy's stomach, even when everyone around him is laughing. And that is exactly where Greg found himself on the night. His family took their brand new station wagon out for its very first ride. Mr. Banks was grinning like a man half his age as he accelerated onto the freeway entry ramp, proudly announcing how easily the big car handled, how light it felt beneath his hands. Terry was already sprawled low in the back seat beside Greg, knees propped up against the front seat, the picture of teenage indifference. Their mother discovered the pull-out drink holder in the dashboard and marveled at it with genuine delight. Terry shot back a dry, sarcastic, "Awesome, Mom," but she was unfazed. She had her drink holder and she was happy. For a moment it was all warmth and newness, and the smell of a fresh car. Then Mr. Banks pulled off the freeway onto a quiet 4-lane highway that curved west, and something shifted. The setting sun hung low on the horizon, like a red coal burning in a charcoal sky. Terry leaned forward and urged his father to put the pedal to the metal, to really see what the car could do. And Mr. Banks, laughing, giddy with the thrill of it, pressed down on the accelerator and obliged. The speedometer climbed, 60, then 70. Mrs. Banks told him firmly to slow down, reminding him the limit was 55. Mr. Banks called himself a crazy teenager and laughed some more, imitating Terry's own word, "awesome," as he blew past smaller cars in the right lane. The headlights of oncoming traffic smeared into white blurs in the darkening evening, and through all of it Greg was quiet. His mother noticed and asked if he was all right. He told her he was fine, but he was not fine. He could not shake the fear sitting heavy inside him. He could not get the image out of his mind, that photograph of a mangled car, twisted and broken, which had haunted him and warned him and refused to let him go. His father asked what he thought of the car, and Greg tried to sound enthusiastic. He really did. "The car's great," he said, but it rang hollow, even to himself. They were doing 75 when Mr. Banks started fumbling across the unfamiliar dashboard, searching for the headlight switch with his right hand, steering with only his left. The road was getting dark, and the lights were not on, and his eyes dropped down away from the highway in front of him. The station wagon drifted left, and then Greg screamed the only words that mattered. "Dad, look out for that truck." Horns blared across the dark highway, and in an instant everything nearly went terribly wrong. A massive truck roared past the Banks family station wagon, its blast of air shoving the car sideways like a giant wave. Mr. Banks yanked the wheel to the right, heart pounding, and slowed the car down as the truck thundered away into the night. He had been fumbling for the headlights and had nearly gotten his family killed for it. Mrs. Banks scolded him, her voice tight with fear. Terry, sitting on the side closest to the truck, said he was fine, but he sounded shaken. Greg asked quietly if they could go home. His father tried to hide his disappointment, suggesting they keep going for ice cream, but Mrs. Banks gently shut that idea down. The adventure was over. They turned around and headed home. Later, safe in his room, Greg pulled out the photograph and stared at it again. There was the station wagon, just as he had seen it before. The driver's side caved in and the windshield shattered. The same car. Their car. The car that had just nearly been destroyed on the highway. He said the word aloud, the only word that fit. Weird. He tucked the photo into the secret compartment in his headboard, right beside the camera, and tried to make sense of it all. He could not, so he decided to try the camera one more time. He thought about taking a picture of himself in the mirror, then realized the flash would ruin it. Instead, he crossed the hall to Terry's room, where his brother sat typing at his computer, his face glowing blue in the monitor light. Greg asked meekly if he could take Terry's picture, claiming Sherry had loaned him the camera. He did not like lying, but he liked the idea of explaining the whole Kaufman housebreak in even less. Terry agreed, stuck out his tongue, and crossed his eyes. Greg snapped the photo, grabbed the developing square, and hurried back to his room before Terry could ask to see it. He sat on the edge of his bed and watched the image take shape. The yellows bled in first, then the reds, then the blues. And when Terry's face finally came into focus, Greg's stomach dropped. Terry's eyes were not crossed. His tongue was not out. His expression was grim, frightened, the face of someone caught in a moment of genuine fear. And he was not in his room. He was outdoors, surrounded by trees, standing near a house that looked achingly familiar. Greg stared at that house. It looked like the one across the street from the playground. He tucked the photo and the camera away and told himself the only reasonable thing he could. The camera was broken. That was all, a broken camera. Not worth worrying about, he stared at the shadows shifting on the ceiling until he believed it. Tuesday afternoon brought warmer air and the sharp, sweet smell of freshly mowed outfield grass. Greg crossed the playground to meet Shari for Bird's Little League game. Squinting into the bright sun as both teams warmed up, and the crack of balls hitting gloves rang out across the diamond. He spotted Shari behind the backstop and held up the camera when she asked if he had brought it. She reached for it immediately. He held on. He tried to explain that the photos just did not come out right, that something was off. But Shari teased him that maybe it was not the camera, but the photographer. She snatched it from his hands, laughing, saying she wanted to catch Bird at the plate because he looked just like an ostrich up there. Bird appeared right on cue, pretending to be insulted, but looking genuinely ridiculous in his oversized shirt, short pants, and a cap bearing the words Pitt's Landing Dolphins. The three of them argued cheerfully about the camera, about the team name, about Bird's supposed athletic genius. Bird pointed out that they had all risked their lives in that basement to get the camera, so it should be shared equally. Greg had not thought about that. He said Bird had a point, but before anyone could settle the matter, a coach hollered for Bird to get back to the field. Greg asked Bird to hold on for just one quick photo. Bird turned around and struck a pose. Shari insisted she would take it. Greg grabbed for the camera at the same moment she raised it. Their hands collided. The camera clicked. The flash fired. A small square slid out from the slot. Shari pulled it free, and the three of them huddled close as the colors bloomed into focus. What they saw made Greg cry out. Bird was in the photo, but not the Bird standing in front of them, in his too big uniform, grinning and posing. This Bird was sprawled on his back on the ground, unconscious, his mouth wrenched open, his neck bent at a horrible angle, his eyes shut tight. The camera had done it again. And this time, the question it left behind was not just weird, it was terrifying. Something was wrong with the camera. That much was certain, but how wrong and how dangerous Greg and Shari were only beginning to understand. It started with the photograph of Bird. He had been standing right there in front of them, joking around on the baseball field, very much alive and upright. But when Shari held up the snapshot, what she saw made her stomach drop. Bird was lying on the ground in the picture, his neck bent at a horrible angle, his eyes shut tight, like he had been knocked out cold, or worse. Bird himself grabbed the photo and tilted it back and forth, squinting at it with a puzzled frown. He chalked it up to a bad camera and jogged off when his coach called him, just like that, casual, unbothered. He had no idea what he had just seen was a picture of himself. Greg knew better. He stood in the warm afternoon sun, thinking quietly. carrying the camera by its strap and swinging it at his side, as he and Shari found a shady patch beside the bleachers. This was not the first time the camera had done something like this. He had been trying to explain it to her, about the snapshot of the new station wagon, about the picture of his brother Terry, but Shari cut him off before he could get the words out. She reminded him about Michael, the photograph that had shown Michael falling down the stairs before he had even fallen. Greg nodded. He knew. He had been living with that knowledge, and it sat in his chest like a stone. Shari took the camera from his hands and started turning it over, determined to get some answers. If there was something wrong with this camera, maybe they could find it by opening it up and looking inside. She asked about the film counter. Greg admitted he could not find one. He could not even tell if the thing was loaded. Together they examined it closely. Where did the film go in? Most automatic cameras loaded in the front, Shari said, so she tried there first. Nothing opened. She tried the back. She tried the bottom. She even tried pulling off the lens. None of it budged. Then Greg noticed something that made him go quiet. He turned the camera over slowly and studied every surface. Then he looked up at Shari with a strange expression. There was no brand name on it, no label, no words of any kind. Shari snatched it back and looked for herself. Squinting hard in the bright sunshine, she turned it over and over, running her fingers across every surface. Finally she handed it back to him, frustrated and a little unsettled. She was right. Nothing, not a single word anywhere on the camera. She wanted to keep trying to open it, so she took it back again and went after it with her fingernails, prying at the back panel, trying to twist the lens. Greg warned her she was going to wreck it, but she shot back that there was nothing to wreck. The camera had no moving parts that either of them could find. Nothing gave, nothing turned, nothing opened. She thrust the camera back at him, making a disgusted face. Greg took it and raised it toward his face, and then he stopped. A sound escaped him, low and startled, and his eyes went wide. Shari turned to see what he was looking at. There, on the ground just outside the first base line, lay Bird. He was sprawled flat on his back, his neck bent at that same odd and unnatural angle from the photograph, his eyes shut tight. The picture had shown them exactly what was going to happen, and now it had. Shari cried out Bird's name first, and Greg's breath caught hard in his throat as they both sprinted toward their friend lying motionless on the ground. They ran side by side at full speed, hearts hammering, dread pulling at every step. Then Bird opened one eye. "Gotcha," he said quietly, that weird half-smile spreading across his face before he exploded into high-pitched laughter. Shari and Greg stood over him, mouths hanging open, completely unable to speak. Greg's heart slowly dragged itself back to a normal rhythm. Then he reached down, grabbed Bird with both hands, and hauled him roughly to his feet. "I'll hold him while you hit him," Greg offered, locking his arms around Bird from behind. Bird squirmed and protested loudly, while Shari grinned and landed a playful punch on his shoulder. After a hard tug, Bird wrenched himself free and danced away from both of them, laughing, brushing blades of cut grass off his uniform pants. He told them they were being ridiculous about the camera. It was broken, that was all, just broken. The photo it had taken of Michael falling down the stairs didn't mean anything strange or mysterious. It meant the camera was wrecked. That was the whole story. Before Greg could argue the point any further, Bird's fielding glove came sailing at his head, and he jogged off toward the outfield with a grin and a wave. Greg and Shari settled onto the bottom bench of the bleachers, the camera still clutched tightly in Greg's hand. The game was not exactly a spectacle. The Dolphins were losing 12-3 going into the third inning, and the bleachers were slowly emptying as spectators gave up and drifted away. A group of kids had already started their own game of catch behind the stands. What the game lacked in quality, it made up for in entertainment, at least where Bird was concerned. Greg laughed as a Cardinal batter slugged a towering ball that sailed clean over Bird's head in the outfield. Then he laughed again when it happened a second time, and a third. By the time Bird's long legs had stalked, walked after the ball and heaved it back toward the diamond, The cardinal runner had already rounded the bases and scored. Loud boos rained down from the bleachers. Shari was dying of thirst, and the sun was punishing. She wanted to leave. Greg made her stay, just long enough to boo Bird when he came up to bat. Despite their best efforts at loud, cupped hand heckling, Bird punched the ball past the shortstop for a single. He tossed his batting helmet aside, adjusted his cap, and took a short lead off first base, pretending not to hear a word Greg shouted at him. Shari tugged at Greg's arm again. The next batter swung and fouled off the first pitch. She said it was too hot. She was dying of thirst. Greg started to answer her. He never finished the sentence. The batter hit the next pitch hard. The ball made a loud thunk, leaving the bat, and a dozen voices cried out at once as it flew across the diamond, a sharp line drive, slamming directly into the side of Bird's head with another sickening thunk. The ball bounced off him and dribbled away onto the infield grass. Bird's eyes went wide with disbelief and confusion. He stood frozen on the base path for a long, horrible moment. Then both his hands shot up above his head, and he let out a shrill cry, long and loud, like the high-pitched whinny of a horse. His eyes rolled back. He sank to his knees and uttered one more cry, softer this time. Then he collapsed onto his back, his neck at an unnatural angle, his eyes closed. He did not move, and for the second time that afternoon, Greg stood staring at his friend, lying motionless on the ground. Only this time there was no half-smile waiting. This time nobody was laughing. In seconds, both coaches and every player on the field came running toward the fallen boy, forming a tight and hushed circle around him, their faces locked in shared horror. Shari leaped off the bleachers, crying out Bird's name, and sprinted toward that terrible circle. Greg moved to follow her, but something stopped him cold. A familiar figure was crossing the street at a full run, waving frantically in his direction. It was Terry, his older brother, and Terry was supposed to be at his after-school job at the Dairy Freeze. Terry came stumbling forward, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down his bright red forehead. He had run all the way there, that much was clear, and as he drew closer, Greg felt a sick feeling creeping up from somewhere deep in his stomach, because Terry's face was carrying an expression Greg had seen before. He had seen it in a photograph. The same frightened expression. The same house standing across the street behind him. The snapshot Greg had taken of his brother had come true, just as the snapshot of Bird lying on the ground had come true. Greg's throat went dry as cotton. His knees had begun to tremble without him even telling them to. Terry placed a heavy hand on Greg's shoulder and said the words that spun the whole world sideways. It was their dad. There had been a bad accident. The new car was totaled, completely totaled, and Greg needed to come home right now. Greg stood there for a moment, the words not quite reaching him, his head spinning as Terry squeezed his shoulder and urged him to hurry. He gripped the camera tightly in one hand and started running after his brother. But just before he reached the street, he turned back toward the playground for one last look at the crowd still huddled around Bird. That was when he saw it, a dark shadow lurking behind the bleachers, someone dressed all in black, standing very still, watching Greg. Terry called out for him to come on. Greg stared hard at the bleachers. The dark figure pulled back and disappeared from sight. Greg shouted that he was coming, and he turned away, leaving behind the playground, the crowd, and whatever that shadow was, as he ran after his brother toward home. The hospital walls were pale green. The nurses scurrying through the brightly lit corridors wore white. The floor tiles beneath Greg's feet were dark brown with orange specks, colors. That was all Greg could see as he hurried with his brother toward their father's room. Blurs of colors, indistinct shapes. His sneakers thudded noisily against the hard tile floor, and he could barely hear them over the pounding of his own heart. The car had been totaled. Just like in the snapshot, Greg and Terry turned a corner. The walls in this corridor were pale yellow. Terry's cheeks were red. 2 doctors passed by in line, green surgical gowns, colours only colours. Greg blinked, tried to see clearly, but it was all passing by too fast, all too unreal. Even the sharp hospital smell, that unique aroma of rubbing alcohol, stale food, and disinfectant, couldn't make it real for him. Then the 2 brothers stepped into their father's room, and it all became real. The colours faded. The images snapped into sharp focus. Their mother jumped up from the folding chair beside the bed. She clenched a wadded-up tissue in her hand, and it was obvious she had been crying. She forced a tight smile onto her face, but her eyes were red, rimmed, her cheeks pale and puffy. Greg returned his mother's greeting in a soft, choked voice. Then his eyes turned to his father. Mr. Banks had a mummy-like bandage covering his hair. One arm was in a cast. The other lay at his side with a tube attached just above the wrist, dripping a dark liquid into his arm. The bedsheet was pulled up to his chest. "Hey, how is it going, guys?" their father asked. His voice sounded fogged in, as if coming from far away. "Dad," Terry started. "He is going to be okay," Mrs. Banks interrupted quickly, seeing the frightened looks on her sons' faces. "I feel great," Mr. Banks said groggily. "You don't look so great," Greg blurted out, stepping up cautiously to the bed. "I am okay, really," their father insisted. "A few broken bones, that is it," he sighed, then winced from pain. "I guess I am lucky. You are very lucky." Mrs. Banks agreed. "What is the lucky part?" Greg wondered silently. He couldn't take his eyes off the tube stuck into his father's arm. Again he thought of the snapshot of the car. It was up in his room at home, tucked into the secret compartment in his headboard. The snapshot showing the car totaled. The driver's side caved in. Should he tell them about it? He couldn't decide. Would they even believe him? "What you break, Dad?" Terry asked, sitting down on the radiator in front of the windowsill and shoving his hands into his jeans pockets. "Your father broke his arm and a few ribs," Mrs. Banks answered, "and he had a slight concussion. The doctors are watching him for internal injuries, but so far, so good." "I was lucky," Mr. Banks repeated. He smiled at Greg. "Dad, I have to tell you about this photo I took," Greg said suddenly, speaking rapidly, his voice trembling with nervousness. "I took a picture of the new car, and the car is completely wrecked," Mrs. Banks interrupted. Sitting on the edge of the folding chair, she rubbed her fingers, working her wedding ring around and around, something she always did when she was nervous. "I am glad you boys didn't see it." Her voice caught in her throat. Then she added, "It is a miracle he wasn't hurt any worse." "This photo," Greg started again. "Latter," his mother said sharply. "Okay." She gave him a meaningful stare. Greg felt his face grow hot. This is important, he thought. Then he decided they probably wouldn't believe him anyway. Who would believe such a crazy story? "Will we be able to get another new car?" Terry asked. Mr. Banks nodded. Carefully. "I have to call the insurance company," he said. "I'll call them when I get home," Mrs. Banks said. "You don't exactly have a hand free." Everyone laughed at that, nervous laughter. "I feel kind of sleepy," Mr. Banks said. His eyes were halfway closed, his voice muffled. "It is the painkillers the doctors gave you," Mrs. Banks told him. She leaned forward and patted his hand. "Get some sleep. I'll come back in a few hours." She stood up, still fiddling with her wedding band, and motioned with her head toward the door. "Bye, Dad," Greg and Terry said in unison. Their father muttered a reply, and they followed their mother out into the hall. "What happened?" Terry asked as they made their way past a nurse's station and down the long pale yellow corridor. "I mean, the accident. Some guy ran right through a red light," Mrs. Banks said. Her red-rimmed eyes focused straight ahead. "He plowed right into your father's side of the car. Said his brakes weren't working." She shook her head, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "I just don't know what to say. Thank goodness he is going to be okay." They turned into the green corridor, walking side by side. Several people were waiting patiently for the elevator at the far end of the hall. Once again, Greg found himself thinking about the snapshots he had taken with the weird camera. First Michael, then Terry, then Bird, then his father. All 4 photos had shown something terrible that hadn't happened yet, and then all 4 photos had come true. Greg felt a chill run through him as the elevator doors opened and the small crowd of people moved forward to squeeze inside. A single question pressed against the inside of his skull like something alive, and it had no easy answer. Did the camera simply show the future, or did it actually cause the terrible things to happen? Greg already knew Bird was okay. He had seen him just the day before, battered but breathing, lucky enough to have walked away without a concussion. But knowing his friend was safe did nothing to quiet the cold, restless fear that had taken up residence somewhere deep in Greg's chest. It was a Saturday afternoon, the following weekend, and Greg had been nearly out the door on his way to Shari's birthday party when the phone rang. It was Shari herself, calling from right next door, and she had one simple demand. She wanted him to bring the camera. Greg refused. He told her plainly, firmly, even desperately, that he had not touched the camera since his father's accident. He had kept it hidden away, buried in the headboard of his bed, as if distance and darkness might contain whatever terrible thing lived inside it. He did not want to bring it. He did not want anyone else to get hurt. But Shari was not having it. It was her birthday, she reminded him, and she pressed her case with the cheerful stubbornness of someone who had not yet had a nightmare about it. She wanted something fun for the party, something different. Her mother had banned everyone from inside the house, and there was nothing else planned. Taking strange pictures with the strange camera sounded like a good time to her, a goof, nothing more. Greg tried one more time. He told her about the dream he had had the night before. He had been outside with his whole family, his mother, his brother Terry, all of them gathered around the backyard barbecue, happy and relaxed. He had raised the camera and kept calling out to them, say cheese, over and over. But when he looked through the viewfinder at the people he loved most, he was not looking at smiling faces. He was looking at skeletons. Their skin was gone, and nothing remained but bone. Shari laughed. She called it a dumb dream. Then she reminded him of something that landed harder than he expected. The camera did not belong to him alone. All 4 of them had been in the Kaufman house that night. All 4 of them had found it together. It belonged to all of them. She told him to bring it, and then she hung up. Greg stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand, the silence of the house pressing in around him. He thought hard. He weighed everything he knew, everything he feared, against a birthday and a best friend's voice that would not take no for an answer. In the end, he walked upstairs. He pulled the camera from its hiding place with trembling hands. He could feel it, the weight of it, the wrongness of it, and he hated that he was holding it again. His stomach knotted up tight with dread. He told himself out loud that it was Shari's birthday, as if saying the words might loosen the knot. It did not, because somewhere beneath the reasoning and the reassurances, Greg knew the truth. He knew it, the way you know a storm is coming before you can see the clouds. He should not be doing this. He knew he should not be doing this. And yet there he stood, the camera in his shaking hands, about to carry it right into the middle of everything he feared most. It was supposed to be a birthday party, balloons, cake, friends, and laughter. But before the afternoon was over, something would go terribly, inexplicably wrong. Greg made his way across the flagstone patio into Shari's backyard, where the party was already buzzing with energy. Bird was there, arms flapping, strutting across the lawn and clucking like a chicken at the top of his voice, explaining to anyone who would listen that ever since that ball hit him, he just could not help himself. Someone hollered at him to go lay an egg, and everyone cracked up. Michael stood nearby, shaking his head, his red hair unbrushed as usual, drowning in a faded flowered Hawaiian shirt about 3 sizes too big for him. Greg held him at arm's length to admire it. Bird announced it came from a cereal box. Michael insisted his grandmother gave it to him. Bird countered that he made it in home easy. Michael protested. Bird bent down, scooped up a clump of dirt from the lawn, and rubbed it on the back of his shirt. "Now this one's dirty too," he declared. Michael grabbed him and shoved him headfirst into the hedge. Then Shari came jogging across the patio, her black hair pulled back in a single braid, an oversized silky yellow top flowing over black spandex leggings, a charm bracelet of tiny silver charms jangling at her wrist. She had one question on her mind. "Did you bring it?" Greg reluctantly held up the camera. It was no ordinary camera. Strange things happened when he used it, and he knew it. But Shari lit up at the sight of it. She wanted to take everyone's picture. That was the fun of it, she said. Greg tried to object, but Shari was already leaning against a tree with her hand behind her head, striking a sophisticated pose, waiting. Greg raised the camera, pressed the button, and the undeveloped white square rolled out. Meanwhile, Michael learned that he and Bird were two of only 3 boys invited to a party with 9 girls. His face fell immediately. Bird asked if they were playing Spin the Bottle. Nina Blake suggested Truth or Dare, and a chorus of girls agreed. Greg groaned quietly to himself. 9 girls, 3 boys, Truth or Dare. It was going to be a disaster. He was so busy dreading the game that he almost forgot about the photograph developing in his hand. Shari grabbed his arm, and they both looked down at it together. The tree was there, perfectly clear, perfectly in focus, but Shari was not. She was simply gone from the image, as if she had never stood there at all. She demanded to know why he had missed her. He insisted he had lined it up carefully. She reminded him, with some irritation, that she was not invisible, that she was not a vampire, that she could see herself in mirrors and did in fact show up in photographs. But the snapshot told a different story. Greg stared hard at the spot in the picture where she had been standing, empty. He slipped the photo into his pocket and took another one, moving closer this time, centering her carefully in the viewfinder. Shari pulled the second photograph from the camera herself and watched the colors darken and take shape. She could not believe what she saw. Again, only the tree. Again, no Shari. She handed it back to Greg, called the camera broken, and told him to forget it. Then she turned to the group and called out for Truth or Dare, leading everyone back into the woods behind the yard, where a circular clearing offered some privacy. The game was exactly as painful as Greg had feared. Only Bird seemed to be genuinely enjoying himself. Bird loves dumb stuff like this, Greg thought, not entirely without envy. After a little more than half an hour, Mrs. Walker's voice drifted out from the house, calling them in for birthday cake. Greg expressed relief with exaggerated sadness. Bird declared they needed to get out of the woods anyway because Michael's shirt was scaring the squirrels. Laughing, the group made their way back to the patio, where the pink and white birthday cake waited on the round umbrella table, its candles all lit and flickering. Mrs. Walker joked that she must be a pretty bad mom for letting them all wander off into the woods. Then she looked around, cake knife in hand, and asked the question that stopped everything cold. Where is Shari? Every head turned, every pair of eyes swept the backyard. Nina said Shari had been with them just a minute ago. Bird cupped his hands to his mouth and called out for her, joking about Earth calling Shari, that it was cake time. Silence answered him. Mrs. Walker checked the house. Greg asked if she had come in through the patio. She had not. Bird ran to the edge of the trees and disappeared inside, still calling her name. When he emerged a few minutes later, he could only shrug. They searched the house, the front yard, the woods again. But Shari, the birthday girl with the jangling charm bracelet, and the yellow top and the single black braid, had vanished completely. And Greg could not stop thinking about those 2 photographs. The ones where she was supposed to be standing right there, plain as day, but was nowhere to be found at all. Greg sat in the shade with his back against the tree trunk, the camera resting on the ground at his side, watching the blue-uniformed policemen move across the backyard. They bent low as they searched through the woods, their voices carrying through the air but impossible to make out. Their faces were intent and bewildered. More policemen arrived, grim-faced and businesslike, and still more after that. Mrs. Walker had called her husband home from a golf game, and now the two of them sat huddled together on canvas chairs in the corner of the patio. They whispered to each other, eyes darting across the yard, holding hands and looking pale and frightened. Everyone else had gone. On the patio table, the birthday setup still sat exactly as it had been left. The candles had burned all the way down, the blue and red wax melting into hard little puddles on the pink and white icing. The cake had not been touched. A red-cheeked officer with a white blonde mustache was telling the Walkers. There was no sign of her. He pulled off his cap and scratched his head, revealing short blonde hair beneath. Mr. Walker asked if someone had taken her away. The officer said there was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anything really. Mrs. Walker sighed loudly and lowered her head, saying she just did not understand it. A long and painful silence followed before the officer said they would keep looking, that he was sure they would find something. He turned toward the woods and stopped short when he nearly walked past Greg sitting against the tree. He stared down at him as if seeing him for the first time, pointing out that Greg was still there, that all the other guests had gone home. Greg replied solemnly, lifting the camera into his lap, that he knew. The officer introduced himself as Officer Riddick and asked why Greg had not gone home like the others after they had spoken. Greg told him he was upset. Shari was a good friend. His throat felt dry and tight as he said it. He gestured toward the house next door and explained that he lived right there. Officer Riddick told him he might as well go home, that the search could take a long time, and they had not found a thing in the woods yet. So Greg said he knew, and as his hand rubbed the back of the camera, his thoughts turned dark and certain. He knew this camera was the reason Shari was missing. He felt miserable and frightened sitting there with it in his hands. Officer Riddick studied Greg's face carefully, as if looking for answers there, and said that one minute she had been there, and the next minute she was gone. Greg agreed and said it was so weird, but inside he was thinking that it was weirder than anyone knew. The camera had made her invisible. First she had vanished from the snapshot, and then she had vanished in real life. He did not know how, but the camera had done it. Officer Riddick asked if Greg had something more to tell him. His hands resting on his hips, his right hand just above the worn brown holster that carried his pistol. He asked if Greg had seen something, anything that might give them a clue, something he had not remembered to mention before. Greg wrestled with himself. He thought about telling the officer everything, but if he did, the man would ask where the camera had come from, and Greg would have to admit he had gotten it from the Kaufman house, that they had broken in there, and everyone would be in trouble. But then the other thought hit him just as hard. Shari was missing, gone, vanished. That was a lot more important than any trouble he might get into. He had almost decided to speak when he hesitated again. Even if he told the officer, the man would not believe him. And how would it actually help bring Shari back? Officer Riddick squatted down beside Greg in the shade and told him he looked very troubled. He said Greg's name gently and asked him to just say what was on his mind, that it would make him feel better. Greg took a deep breath and glanced up at the patio. Mrs. Walker had covered her face with her hands. Her husband leaned over her, trying to offer comfort. Then the words came out before Greg could stop them. It was the camera, he blurted. He could feel his pulse hammering against his temples. He took another breath and kept going. He explained that the camera was strange. He had taken Shari's picture before. When he first arrived, 2 pictures, and she had been invisible in both of them. Everything else had shown up, but not Shari. And then later she had vanished for real. The camera predicted the future, or maybe it made bad things happen. He raised it, trying to hand it over. Officer Riddick did not reach for it. He simply stared hard at Greg, his eyes narrowing, his expression turning cold and hard. Greg felt a sudden stab of fear cut right through him. The officer was not looking at him with curiosity or concern. He was looking at him with something else entirely, and Greg had no idea what was going to happen next. Greg still held the camera out toward the policeman, desperate for someone to believe him. But Officer Riddick climbed to his feet and fixed Greg with a burning gaze. "The camera makes bad things happen?" he asked. "Yes," Greg told him. "It isn't my camera, see? And every time I take a picture—" "Son, that is enough," Officer Riddick said gently. He reached down and rested a hand on Greg's trembling shoulder, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "I think you are very upset, Greg. I don't blame you. This is very upsetting for everyone." "But it is true," Greg started to insist. "I am going to ask that policeman over there," Officer Riddick said, pointing toward the hedge, "to take you home now, and I am going to have him tell your parents that you've been through a very frightening experience." Greg felt the humiliation burn through him. He had known, somehow, that this would happen. How could he have been so stupid? Now the officer thought he was some kind of a nutcase. "No, that is okay," Greg said quickly, pulling himself to his feet and cradling the camera against his chest. "I can make it home okay." Officer Riddick eyed him with suspicion. "You sure?" "Yeah, I can walk by myself." "If you have anything to tell me later," the officer said, his gaze dropping down to the camera, "just call the station." "Okay," Greg replied, moving slowly toward the front of the house. "Don't worry, Greg. We'll do our best," Officer Riddick called after him. "We'll find her. Put the camera away and try to get some rest." "Okay, okay," Greg muttered, hurrying past the walkers, who were still huddled together under their umbrella on the patio. "Why was I so stupid?" he asked himself as he walked home. "Why did I expect that policeman to believe such a weird story?" The worst part was the thought creeping in behind the anger. He wasn't even sure he believed it himself. A few minutes later, he pulled open the back screen door and stepped into the kitchen. "Anybody home?" Silence. He moved through the back hall toward the living room. "Anyone home?" Still nothing. Terry was at work. His mother must have gone to visit his dad at the hospital. Greg felt the emptiness settle over him like a weight. He didn't want to be alone right now. He wanted to talk to someone. He wanted to tell them about what had happened to Shari. Still cradling the camera, he climbed the stairs to his room. He stopped in the doorway, blinked twice, and then let out a cry of horror. His books were scattered all over the floor. The covers had been ripped from his bed. Every desk drawer hung open, their contents thrown around the room. The desk lamp lay on its side on the floor. All of his clothes had been yanked from the dresser and the closet and tossed everywhere. Someone had been in Greg's room, and they had turned it completely upside down, and the question hung in the air like a cold, dark fog. Who had done this, and what on earth had they been looking for? Greg stood frozen in the doorway, staring in horror at his ransacked room. Every drawer pulled out, every item thrown aside. Someone had torn through his belongings with desperate, searching hands, and as the shock settled over him like a cold wave, Greg realized with a sickening certainty that he already knew who had done it. Someone had been looking for the camera, someone who wanted it back badly enough to break into a house, to dig through a boy's private things. Spidey, the creepy figure dressed all in black, the one who lived in the old Kaufman house. He had to be the owner of that camera. He had been watching Greg from behind the bleachers at the Little League game, silent and still as a shadow. He had known Greg had the camera, and worse, far worse than any of that, he had known exactly where Greg lived. That thought was the most chilling of all. He knew where Greg lived. Greg turned away from the wreckage of his room and leaned against the hallway wall, squeezing his eyes shut. Behind his eyelids, the image of Spidey played over and over. That dark figure creeping along so evilly on his spindly legs. And now Greg pictured him here, inside the house, inside Greg's own room, poring through his things, wrecking everything. Greg stepped back into the doorway and stared at the chaos before him. A storm of feelings rose up all at once. He wanted to shout with anger. He wanted to cry out for help. But he was completely alone. No one to hear him. No one to come running. He stood there in that terrible silence, leaning against the doorframe, and slowly, out of all that fear and confusion, one clear thought cut through. He knew what he had to do. Greg held the phone receiver in one hand and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the other. He had never worked so hard or so fast in all his life. His room was almost back to normal. He had put everything back, cleaned and straightened, and his parents would never guess a thing. But tidying his room was the least of his worries. Sherry was still missing, and that fact sat on his chest like a stone. Did they find Sherry? Bird asked eagerly on the other end of the line. "I haven't heard, I don't think so," Greg said, his eyes still sweeping the room. He told Bird this wasn't why he was calling. Speaking rapidly, urgently, he asked Bird to get Michael and meet him at the playground by the baseball diamond. Now, right away. Bird protested that it was almost dinner time, and he wasn't sure his parents would let him out. Greg cut him off. It was important. He had to see them both. Bird relented and lowered his voice, agreeing to sneak out for a few minutes. But then, in classic Bird fashion, he immediately hollered to his mother that he was talking to no one, that it was only Greg. Greg rolled his eyes. Bird was a worse liar than he was, and that was saying something. After he hung up, Greg stood still for a moment and listened. Silence downstairs. His mother still wasn't home. She didn't know about Shari yet, and Greg knew that when she found out, she and his dad were going to be very upset. Almost as upset as he was, he drifted to his bedroom window and looked down into the yard next door. The policemen were all gone now. Shari's shaken parents had retreated inside. The yard was quiet and still, except for a squirrel sitting beneath the wide shade of the big tree, gnawing furiously at an acorn with another one resting at his feet. And there, in the corner of the window's view, sat the birthday cake, still on the table, forlorn and untouched. The places were all set, the decorations were still standing. It looked like a birthday party waiting for guests who would never come. A birthday party for ghosts. Greg shuddered and pulled himself away from that image. "Shari is alive," he said aloud, as if saying the words could make them true. "They'll find her. She is alive." He knew what he had to do. He forced himself away from the window and hurried out to meet his friends. "No way," Bird said heatedly, leaning against the bleacher bench. "Have you gone totally bananas?" Greg swung the camera by its cord and turned hopefully to Michael. But Michael avoided his stare, his eyes fixed on the camera. "I am with Bird," he said quietly. It was nearly dinner time, and the playground was almost deserted. A few little kids pumped lazily on the swings at the far end. 2 others rode their bikes around and around the soccer field, going nowhere in particular. The whole world felt sleepy and ordinary, which only made Greg's situation feel stranger and more desperate by contrast. "I thought maybe you guys would come with me," Greg said, his disappointment thick in his voice. He kicked up a clump of grass with his sneaker, then raised the camera. "I have to return this thing. I know it is what I have to do. I have to put it back where I found it." "No way," Bird repeated, shaking his head firmly. "I am not going back to the Kaufman house. Once was enough." "Chicken?" Greg shot back, his voice edged with anger. "Yeah," Bird admitted quickly, without any shame at all. Michael pulled himself up the side of the bleachers, climbed to the 3rd deck of seats, then lowered himself back to the ground, restless and thinking. "You don't have to take it back," he argued. "What do you mean?" Greg asked impatiently, kicking at the grass again. "Just toss it, Greg," Michael urged, making a throwing motion with one hand. "Heave it, throw it in the trash somewhere." "Yeah, or leave it right here," Bird suggested. He reached for the camera. "Give it to me. I'll hide it under the seats." "You don't understand," Greg said, swinging the camera out of Bird's reach. He wasn't being stubborn, he was scared, and he needed them to feel that. Throwing it away won't do any good." "Why not?" Bird asked, making another swipe at it. "Spidey will just come back for it," Greg told him, his voice rising. "He'll come back to my room looking for it. He'll come after me, I know it." "But what if we get caught taking it back?" Michael asked, and for a moment the fear in his voice matched Greg's own. "Yeah, what if Spidey's there in the Kaufman house and he catches us?" Bird added. "You don't understand," Greg cried out. "He knows where I live. He was in my house. He was in my room. He wants his camera back. And here, give it to me," Bird cut in. "We don't have to go back to that house. He can find it right here." He grabbed again for the camera. Greg held tight to the strap and tried to pull it away, but Bird caught the side of the camera with both hands. "No," Greg cried out as it flashed, and whirred. A square of film slid out from the bottom. "No!" Greg cried again, horrified, staring at the small white square as it slowly began to develop. Bird had taken his picture, his hand trembling. Greg peeled the snapshot free from the camera and held it up. What would it show? Before Greg could even finish his apology, a voice cut through the air from behind the bleachers like a blade. Two tough-looking boys stepped out of the shadows, their eyes locked onto the camera with the focused hunger of predators who had just spotted something worth taking. Greg recognized them immediately. Joey Ferris and Mickey Ward, two ninth-graders with a reputation that walked ahead of them wherever they went. They were the kind of boys who stole bikes and dumped them in ditches, who terrorized younger kids just because they could. There was even a rumor floating around school that Mickey had once beaten a kid so badly the boy was crippled for life. Greg was pretty sure Mickey had invented that rumor himself and spread it just to watch people flinch. Both boys were big for their age. Neither of them did well in school, and somehow, despite the stealing and the fighting and the general menace they dragged behind them like a shadow, neither of them ever seemed to face any real consequences. Joey had short blonde hair slicked straight up, a diamond stud in one ear, and small grey eyes that burned when they looked at you. Mickey had a round red face covered in pimples, stringy black hair falling to his shoulders, and was working a toothpick between his teeth like he had all the time in the world. Both wore heavy metal T-shirts and jeans. Bird announced he had to get home, practically dancing sideways away from the bleachers. Michael said the same thing, and he could not keep the fear from showing plainly on his face. Greg quietly tucked the snapshot into his jeans pocket. Then Joey reached out and grabbed the camera right out of Greg's hand, his grey eyes burning into Greg's as if daring him to react. "Thanks, man," he said, grinning. Mickey immediately wrestled it away from his friend, insisting it was his. The two of them batted it back and forth like a toy while Greg reached out his hand and told them firmly to give it back. He tried to soften his voice and appeal to whatever small sliver of reason might exist between them. He explained it was not even his. He had to return it to the owner. Mickey did not care. He declared himself the new owner and asked if Greg had ever heard of finders keepers. Joey leaned over Greg with all his height and muscle, making the threat in the air thicker than before. Michael whispered in Greg's ear that maybe they should just let the boys have the camera. After all, Greg had wanted to get rid of the thing, but Greg refused immediately with a firmness that surprised even himself. Joey turned on Michael, mocking his freckles. Michael could only manage a meek, quiet reply. Then Bird made a joke about Mickey's face breaking the camera, which earned a brittle laugh from the crowd and an immediate threat from Joey, who raised a big fist and suggested that Bird's smile could be made permanent in a very different way. Mickey pointed at Bird and told Joey he knew the kid, that Bird thought he was hot stuff. Both boys stared hard at Bird, working to frighten him. Bird swallowed and stepped back against the bleachers. He said quietly that he did not think he was anything special. Joey offered a cruel insult, and the two boys broke into high-pitched hyena laughs, slapping each other high fives with the particular joy of people who enjoy cruelty for its own sake. Greg kept pressing. He told them the camera was broken, that it was no use to anyone. Michael backed him up, but Mickey raised the camera anyway and pointed it straight at Joey. And that was when something shifted inside Greg, because if they took a picture with that camera, they might discover its secret, that the snapshots it produced showed the future, that they showed only terrible things happening to people, that the camera was evil, and maybe, just maybe, it caused the evil it showed. He could not let that happen. He had to get the camera back to the Kaufman house, back to Spidey, and that was all there was to it. Without stopping to think, Greg lunged forward and snatched the camera right out of Mickey's hands. He shouted for Bird and Michael to run, and the three of them turned and bolted across the deserted playground, sneakers pounding over dry grass, hearts hammering. Greg's thoughts raced as fast as his legs. They were going to be caught. They were going to get pounded. They were dead meat. But when the three of them finally crossed the street and dared to look back, breathing noisily and waiting for the worst, Joey and Mickey had not moved a single inch. They were leaning against the bleachers, laughing. Joey called after them that he would catch them later. Mickey repeated it. Then both of them burst into laughter again, as if it were the funniest thing either of them had ever said. Michael said it had been too close. Bird said those two meant every word, that the three of them were history. Greg tried to insist it was all tough talk, hot air. Michael immediately pointed out that if that were true, they would not have run the way they did. Bird joked that they were just late for dinner and started heading home. The attempt to return the camera to the Kaufman house would have to wait. It was too late now, Michael said. They would have to do it tomorrow. Greg asked eagerly if they would both come with him, and was met with vague, evasive non-answers as his two friends peeled away from him and disappeared in different directions across lawns and driveways. Greg ran home alone, the camera still in his grip. He had almost made it to his front yard when he remembered the snapshot he had shoved into his pocket during the confrontation. He stopped in the driveway and pulled it out. The sun was dropping behind the garage, painting everything in long, dim shadows. He held the photograph up close to his face to make it out clearly. What he saw made the breath stop in his chest. "Oh no," he cried out. "I don't believe it." And just like that, whatever small sense of relief he had felt from outrunning Joey and Mickey dissolved completely, swallowed whole by something far worse waiting for him in that little square of developing film. This is the story of a boy with a terrible secret, a missing friend and a photograph that should not exist. Greg stood frozen in his front yard, his hand trembling as he stared at the snapshot he held. It had been taken just minutes before, out on the playground in front of the bleachers. But somehow, impossibly, Shari was in it. There she was, standing close beside him, the baseball diamond clear in the background behind them both. And they were not smiling for the camera. They were staring straight ahead, eyes wide, mouths open, their faces locked in expressions of pure horror as a large shadow fell across them both. Greg lowered the photo and spun around, his voice cracking as he called out into the yard. "Shari, are you here? Can you hear me?" Only silence answered him. He tried again, more desperate this time. Then a voice called his name, and he nearly jumped out of his skin before he realized it was only his mother calling from the front door. He slid the snapshot into his pocket and went inside, feeling dazed and hollow, sad and confused and frightened all at once. 2 days crawled past. The sky hung low and grey, the air thick with heat and smog, and Greg paced his empty room after school, wearing a path in the floor with his worry. His brother Terry was off at his job. His mother had gone to the hospital to bring his father home at last. Greg knew he should have felt something like happiness about that, but the fear had taken up too much room inside him. Shari still had not been found. The police had run out of ideas and settled on a new theory, that she had been kidnapped. Her parents sat at home beside the phone, waiting for a call that never came. No ransom demand, no clues, nothing but silence and grief and the slow passage of time. But Greg knew the truth, or believed he did. The camera had made her disappear. He was certain of it, and that certainty crushed him because he could not tell a single soul. Who would believe him? He could already hear how it would sound. Cameras cannot be evil. Cameras cannot make people fall downstairs or crash their cars or vanish from the face of the earth. Cameras only record what is already there. He pressed his forehead against his bedroom window and stared down into Shari's empty backyard, at the tree where she had posed, and whispered her name into the glass. The camera was still hidden in its secret compartment in his headboard. Bird and Michael had both refused to help him return it to the old Kaufman house. Greg had decided to hold on to it anyway, in case he ever needed his proof, in case he found someone brave enough to confide in. And underneath all of that, there was another fear, a quieter and colder one. He was afraid that Spidey would come back to Greg's room, back for the camera. He pushed himself away from the window and reached into the headboard, pulling out 2 of the snapshots he had tucked away alongside the camera. They were the ones from Shari's birthday party, taken just before everything went wrong. He held one in each hand and stared at them, hoping that this time he might see something new. But they had not changed. They showed the backyard, green in the sunlight, the old tree standing tall, and where Shari should have been standing, there was nothing, no one, just empty air, as if the camera had seen straight through her. Something broke open inside Greg then. Before he even knew what he was doing, he was tearing the photos apart. He ripped them into smaller and smaller pieces, panting, his chest heaving with each tear, until both snapshots were nothing but a pile of tiny paper shards scattered across the floor. Then he threw himself face down on his bed and closed his eyes, waiting for his heart to slow, waiting for the crushing weight of guilt and horror to lift even slightly. 2 hours passed. Then the phone rang. Greg reached over and answered it. It was Shari. Greg could not believe what he was hearing. Shari was back. Her voice crackled through the phone line, alive and real and unmistakably hers, and all he could do was shout her name like a question, like something he was afraid to trust. She sounded just as stunned as he did. She had been home for 2 hours, she told him, and her mother had not stopped crying since the moment she walked through the door. Greg admitted he felt like crying too, because Shari had been gone, truly gone, and now here she was again, and nothing about it made any sense. He asked her where she had been. The line went quiet for a long, aching moment. She did not know. She said finally, 1 minute she was at her own birthday party. The next minute she was standing in front of her house. 2 days had passed, but she had no memory of leaving, no memory of being anywhere else, no memory of anything at all. Her voice trembled as she said it. Not a single thing, Greg pressed her. What about the camera? What about the photographs? The ones where she had been invisible? She finished the thought before he could. She had been invisible in the pictures, and then she had disappeared. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. Not out loud, not completely. There was no time. The police had arrived at her door to question her, and she had no idea what she was going to tell them. She sounded frightened. She hung up. Greg sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the phone for a long time after she was gone. Shari had come back about 2 hours ago. 2 hours. He turned to look at the clock radio on the nightstand. 2 hours ago, almost exactly. He had taken the 2 snapshots of an invisible Shari and ripped them to pieces. The ideas that started moving through his mind were wild ones, maybe even insane ones. But he could not make them stop. Had he brought Shari back by destroying those photos? Did that mean the camera had caused her to vanish in the first place? Did it mean the camera was responsible for every terrible thing that had appeared in its pictures? He sat with those questions for a long time, and when he was done sitting with them, he knew 2 things. He had to talk to Shari, and he had to return the camera to the house where he found it. They met on the playground the next afternoon under a wide, clear sky. A ragged soccer game raged across the outfield nearby, kids running in every direction, shouting over each other. When Shari came jogging toward him, Greg felt a rush of relief so strong He reached out and pinched her arm, just to be sure she was solid and real. He told her she looked like herself. She did not smile. She told him she felt fine, just confused and exhausted. The police had questioned her for hours. When they finally left, her parents had taken over. She pressed her back against the bleachers and shook her head, saying her mother and father somehow seemed to think the whole thing was her fault. Greg muttered that it was the camera's fault. He looked up and met her eyes. The camera was evil. He meant it. Shari shrugged. She honestly did not know what to think. He showed her the photograph then, the one that showed the two of them standing on this very playground, faces frozen in horror as a dark shadow crept over them. She stared at it and called it weird, because it was. Greg told her he wanted to take the camera back to the Kaufman house. He could go get it right now. He wanted to know if she would come with him. Shari started to answer, but she stopped. They both stopped, because the shadow was already moving, sliding over the grass toward them, quick and silent and wrong, and behind the shadow came the man dressed all in black, his long spindly legs pumping hard as he came straight for them. Spidey. Greg grabbed Shari's hand. Neither of them could move. They stood frozen, staring in terror, as Spidey's slithering shadow crept over them both, just like in the photograph, just like they had feared, and somehow always known it would. Greg felt it the moment he saw the dark figure moving toward them, a shudder of recognition. The snapshot had come true. Spidey came crawling out of the shadows like a black tarantula, his long legs eating up the ground between them. Greg grabbed Shari's hand and screamed a single word in a voice he barely recognized as his own. Run, they ran, both of them, without another word, gasping and pounding across the grass toward the street. Their sneakers slapped the sidewalk as they sprinted, lungs burning, legs pumping. Greg threw a glance back over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. Spidey was closing the gap, his face still swallowed by the shadow of that black baseball cap, moving with a terrifying long-legged speed that seemed almost inhuman. Greg cried out to Shari that he was catching up, that he was too fast, that they weren't going to make it. His chest felt ready to split open. Spidey's shadow scuttled over the grass behind them like something alive, getting closer and closer with every heartbeat. Then a car horn blasted through the night, and Greg screamed. He and Shari skidded to a stop. The horn sounded again, and Greg spun around to find a familiar face behind the wheel of a small hatchback. It was Jerry Norman, a young man who lived right across the street. Jerry rolled down his window and called out, asking if this man was chasing them. Without even waiting for an answer, he threw the car into reverse and backed it toward Spidey, warning him loudly that he was calling the police. Spidey said nothing. He turned and darted hard across the street, disappearing behind a tall hedge like smoke swallowed by the dark. Jerry called after him, then turned his attention back to the two kids, his voice tight with concern. Greg, still heaving for breath, managed to tell him they were fine. Shari thanked Jerry with what little voice she had left. Jerry told them he had seen that guy around the neighborhood before, that he never figured him for dangerous. He asked if they wanted him to call the police. Greg said no, because deep down, Greg already understood. As soon as he gave Spidey back his camera, all of this would stop. That was the deal, even if it had never been spoken out loud. Jerry studied their faces for a long moment, offered them a lift, and when they refused, warned them once more to be careful before pulling away, his tires shrieking around the corner. The quiet that followed felt enormous. Shari stood staring at the tall hedge, her voice hushed, asking why Spidey had been chasing them. Greg told her the truth. Spidey thought Greg had the camera. He wanted it back. And then Greg said what he needed to say, what he had maybe been building toward for longer than he realized. He asked her to meet him the next day, in front of the Kaufman house, to help him put the camera back where it belonged. Shari looked at him, her expression caught somewhere between caution and understanding. Greg pressed forward, telling her quietly but firmly that all of them were going to stay in danger until they made this right. Shari held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single quiet word, "Tomorrow." Something scurried through the tall weeds of the unmowed front lawn, and Shari flinched, dropping her voice to a whisper, even though no one else was in sight. What was that? It was too big to be a squirrel. She stayed close behind Greg, who had stopped to stare up at the Kaufman house with the camera gripped tightly in both hands. Maybe it was a raccoon or something, he told her, though he did not sound entirely convinced. It was a little after 3 o'clock the next afternoon, a hazy, overcast day. Mountains of dark clouds threatening rain were rolling across the sky, stretching behind the house and casting it in deep shadow. The whole scene felt wrong, like the world itself was holding its breath. "It is going to storm," Shari said, pressing close behind him. "Let's get this over with and go home." "Good idea," Greg agreed, glancing up at the heavy sky as thunder rumbled in the distance, low and long. The old trees dotting the front yard whispered and shook, but going inside was not as simple as just walking through the door. "We can't just run inside," he reminded her. "First we have to make sure Spidey isn't there." They moved quickly through the tall grass and weeds and stopped at the living room window, peering in. Thunder rolled again, low and dragging. Greg thought he saw another creature scuttle through the weeds around the corner of the house. His stomach tightened. "It is too dark in there. I can't see a thing," Shari complained. "Let's check out the basement," Greg suggested. "That is where Spidey hangs out, remember?" The sky darkened to an eerie green as they made their way to the back of the house and dropped to their knees to peer down through the basement windows at ground level. Squinting through the dust-covered window panes, they could make out the makeshift plywood table, the wardrobe against the wall with its doors still hanging open, colorful old clothing spilling out onto the floor, and empty frozen food boxes scattered everywhere. "No sign of him," Greg whispered, cradling the camera in his arm as though it might try to escape if he loosened his grip. "Let's get moving." "Are you sure?" Shari stammered. She wanted to be brave, she truly did, but the thought that she had disappeared for 2 whole days completely vanished, most likely because of that camera. That frightening thought would not leave her mind. Michael and Bert had been called chicken for backing out, but maybe, she thought quietly, they were the smart ones. She wished this were over, all of it finished. A few seconds later, Greg and Shari pushed open the front door. They stepped into the darkness of the front hall and stopped and listened. The silence pressed in around them like something alive, and then they both jumped at the sound of a loud, sudden crash directly behind them. Shari was the first to find her voice. "It is just the door," she cried. "The wind." A gust had made the front door slam. Nothing more. "Let's get this over with," Greg whispered, badly shaken. "We never should have broken into this house in the first place," Shari whispered back as they made their way on tiptoe, step by creaking step, down the dark hallway toward the basement stairs. "It is a little late for that," Greg replied sharply. He pulled open the door to the basement steps and stopped again. "What is that banging sound upstairs?" Shari's features tightened in fear as she heard it too. A repeated, almost rhythmic banging filled the air above them. "Shutters?" Greg suggested. "Yeah," she quickly agreed, breathing a sigh of relief. "A lot of the shutters are loose, remember." The entire house seemed to groan around them. Thunder rumbled outside, closer now. They stepped onto the landing and waited for their eyes to adjust to the darkness. "Couldn't we just leave the camera up here and run?" Shari asked. It was more of a plea than a question. "Number, I want to put it back," Greg insisted. "But Greg," she tugged at his arm as he started down the stairs. "No!" He pulled out of her grasp. "He was in my room, Shari. He tore everything apart looking for it. I want him to find it where it belongs. If he doesn't find it, he'll come back to my house. I know he will. Okay, okay. Let's just hurry." It was brighter in the basement, grey light seeping down from the 4 ground-level windows. Outside, the wind swirled and pushed against the window panes. A pale flash of lightning made shadows flicker against the basement wall. The old house groaned as if unhappy about the storm. What was that? Footsteps. Shari stopped halfway across the basement and listened. "It is just the house," Greg insisted, but his quavering voice revealed that he was every bit as frightened as his companion, and he stopped to listen too. Bang, bang. The shutter high above them continued its rhythmic pounding. "Where did you find the camera, anyway?" Shari whispered, following Greg to the far wall across from the enormous furnace, with its cobweb ducts sprouting up like pale tree limbs. "Over here," Greg told her. He stepped up to the work table and reached for the vise clamped on the edge. "When I turned the vise, a door opened up, some kind of hidden shelf. That is where the camera—" He cranked the handle of the vise. Once again, the door to the secret shelf popped open. "Good," he whispered excitedly. He flashed Shari a smile, then shoved the camera onto the shelf. Tucking the carrying strap under it, he pushed the door closed. "We're out of here." He felt so much better, so relieved, so much lighter. The house groaned and creaked around him, but Greg didn't care. Another flash of lightning, brighter this time, like a camera flash, sent shadows flickering across the wall. "Come on," he whispered, but Shari was already ahead of him, picking her way carefully over the food cartons strewn everywhere, hurrying toward the steps. They were halfway up the stairs, Greg one step behind Shari, when, above them, Spidey stepped silently into view on the landing, blocking their escape. Greg blinked and shook his head as if he could shake away the image of the dark figure looming above him on the stairs. "No," Shari cried out, stumbling back against Greg. He grabbed for the railing, forgetting it had already given way during their first terrible visit to the house. Luckily, Shari caught her balance before sending them both tumbling down into the dark. Lightning flashed behind them, throwing a sheet of white light across the stairway, but the unmoving figure on the landing above remained wrapped in shadow, still and silent. "Let us go," Greg finally managed to shout, finding his voice. "Yeah, we returned your camera," Shari added, her voice high and frightened. Speedy did not reply. Instead, he took one slow step toward them, then another, descending with terrible, quiet steadiness. Greg and Shari backed down to the basement floor, nearly stumbling as the wooden stairs groaned and squeaked beneath his weight. When he finally reached the bottom, a crackling bolt of lightning washed the room in blue, and the children saw his face for the very first time. He was old, far older than they had imagined. His eyes were small and round like dark marbles. His mouth was small too, pressed into a tight and menacing grimace. "We returned the camera," Shari said, her voice trembling. "Can't we go now, please?" "Let me see," the man said. His voice was younger than his face, warmer than his cold eyes. "Come." They hesitated, but he gave them no real choice. He ushered them back across the cluttered floor to the work table, wrapped a large spidery hand around the vise, and turned the handle. The door swung open. He pulled out the camera and held it close to examine it carefully. "You shouldn't have taken it," he told them, speaking softly, turning the camera slowly in his hands. "We're sorry," Shari said quickly. "Can we go now?" Greg asked, edging toward the stairs. "It is not an ordinary camera," the man said, raising his small eyes to them. "We know," Greg blurted out. "The pictures it took." The man's eyes went wide and his expression darkened with anger. "You took pictures with it." "Just a few," Greg told him, wishing immediately that he had kept his mouth shut. "They didn't come out, really." "You know about the camera, then," the figure said, moving swiftly to the center of the floor. Greg wondered if he was trying to block their escape. "It is broken or something," Greg said uncertainly, shoving his hands into his jeans pockets. "It is not broken," the tall, dark figure said quietly. "It is evil." He motioned toward the low plywood table. "Sit there." Greg and Shari exchanged a nervous glance. Then, reluctantly, they sat down on the edge of the board, rigid and tense, their eyes darting again and again toward the stairway and the possibility of escape. "The camera is evil," the man repeated, standing over them, holding it in both hands. I should know. I helped to create it. You are an inventor? Greg asked. I am a scientist, the man replied. Or I should say, I was a scientist. My name is Fredericks. Dr. Fritz Fredericks. He shifted the camera from one hand to the other. My lab partner invented this camera. It was his pride and joy. More than that, it would have made him a fortune. Would have, I say. He paused, a heavy and thoughtful expression settling over his aged face. What happened to him? Did he die? Shari asked, still nervously twisting a strand of her black hair around her fingers. Dr. Frederick snickered. Number worse. I stole the invention from him. I stole the plans and the camera. I was evil, you see. I was young and greedy, so very greedy, and I wasn't above stealing to make my fortune. He paused, eyeing them both, as if waiting for them to say something, perhaps to offer their judgment. But when Greg and Shari remained silent, staring up at him, he continued his story. When I stole the camera, it caught my partner by surprise. Unfortunately, from then on, all of the surprises were mine. A strange, sad smile twisted across his face. My partner, you see, was much more evil than I was. Dr. Fredericks coughed into his hand, then began to pace slowly in front of them, speaking softly, as if remembering the story for the first time in a very long while. My partner was a true evil one. He dabbled in the dark arts. I should correct myself. He didn't just dabble. He was quite a master of it all. He held the camera up, waving it above his head, then lowering it again. My partner put a curse on the camera. If he couldn't profit from it, he wanted to make sure that I never would either, and so he put a curse on it. He turned his gaze directly on Greg, leaning over him. Do you know how some primitive peoples fear the camera? They believe that if it takes their picture, it will steal their soul. He patted the camera gently. Well, this camera really does steal souls. Greg stared up at it and shuddered. The camera had already stolen Shari away once. It could have stolen all of their souls. People have died because of this camera, Dr. Frederick said, letting out a long, sad sigh. People close to me, that is how I came to learn of the curse, to learn of the camera's evil. And then I learned something just as frightening. The camera cannot be destroyed. He coughed, cleared his throat, and began to pace again. And so I vowed to keep the camera a secret, to keep it away from people so it cannot do its evil. I lost my job, my family. I lost everything because of it. But I am determined to keep the camera where it can do no harm. He stopped pacing, his back toward them, his shoulders hunched, lost somewhere deep in thought. Greg climbed quietly to his feet and motioned for Shari to do the same. Well, I guess it is good we returned it, he said carefully. Sorry we caused so much trouble. Yeah, we're very sorry, Shari added with real sincerity. Guess it is back in the right hands. Goodbye, Greg said, moving toward the steps. It is getting late, and we... No, Dr. Frederick shouted, and the sudden force of it startled them both into stillness. He moved fast, planting himself directly between them and the stairway. I am afraid you can't go, he said. You know too much. And just like that, the door they had so desperately been inching toward was no longer a possibility. The strange old scientist who had guarded his terrible secret for years was not about to let two children carry it back out into the world. The camera sat silent in his hands, and the question hanging over everything was a dreadful one. Now that Greg and Shari knew the truth, what exactly did Dr. Fredericks intend to do with them? The storm outside was nothing compared to the terror brewing in that basement. Dr. Fredericks stood before them in the cold blue flicker of lightning, his bony arms crossed over his black sweatshirt, and spoke words that turned Greg and Shari's blood to ice. He could never let them leave. Greg's voice climbed from a statement into a desperate plea. They wouldn't tell anyone, he promised. Not a soul. Shari backed him up, her frightened eyes darting to Greg. insisting that the doctor could trust them. And even if they did say something, she reasoned who in the world would ever believe them. But Dr. Fredericks was done listening. He snapped at them to stop talking, because no amount of words would do them any good. He had worked too long and too hard to keep the camera a secret, and he was not about to let two kids unravel everything he had built. The wind shoved hard against the basement windows with a long, low howl dragging sheets of rain behind it. The sky beyond the glass had gone as black as midnight. Shari cried out that he couldn't keep them there forever, and her voice cracked with a terror she could no longer contain. The doctor drew himself up to his full height, and somehow he seemed to grow taller in that dim room. His small eyes burned into hers. He said he was sorry, in a voice barely above a whisper, truly sorry, but he had no choice. He moved toward them. Greg and Shari shot each other panic glances. The basement staircase, their only way out, felt like it was 100 miles behind them. Greg shouted over a burst of thunder that rattled the windows, demanding to know what Fredericks planned to do. Shari begged him to stop. Then the doctor lunged forward with a speed that caught them both off guard. Holding the camera in one hand, he seized Greg's shoulder with the other. Greg screamed and twisted, fighting to break free. Shari screamed too, and then something clicked in her mind. Both of the doctor's hands were occupied. This was her only chance, maybe the only one she would ever get. She pulled in a deep breath and threw herself forward. Dr. Frederick's eyes went wide with shock as Shari grabbed the camera with both hands and wrenched it away from him. He made a frantic swipe to take it back, and in that same moment Greg burst free of his grip. Before the desperate man could take another step, Shari raised the camera to her eye and aimed the lens directly at him. The old man lurched forward, his eyes wild with fear, begging her not to push the button. He grabbed the camera with both hands, and suddenly Greg stood watching in horror as Shari and Dr. Fredericks grappled with each other, both holding on for their lives, each straining to wrestle the camera away. Then the flash went off. Brilliant white light exploded through the basement, startling all three of them into stillness. In that stunned moment, Shari seized the camera and screamed one single word: "Run." The basement was a whirring blur of greys and blacks as Greg hurled himself toward the stairs. He and Shari ran side by side, slipping over food cartons, jumping over tin cans and empty bottles. Rain thundered against the windows. The wind howled, pushing against the glass. Behind them, they could hear Dr. Frederick screaming in anguish. "Did it take our picture or his?" Shari cried out as they ran. "I don't know. Just hurry." Greg screamed back. The old man was howling like a wounded animal, his cries competing with the storm raging outside. The stairs were not that far away, but it seemed to take forever to reach them. Forever, Greg thought. Dr. Fredericks had wanted to keep Shari and him down there forever. Panting loudly, they both reached the dark stairway. A deafening clap of thunder made them stop and turn around. "Ah!" Greg cried aloud. To his shock, Dr. Fredericks had not chased after them. His anguished cries had stopped. The basement was silent. "What is going on?" Shari cried breathlessly. Squinting back into the darkness, it took Greg a moment to realize that the dark, rumpled form lying on the floor in front of the work table was Dr. Fredericks. "What happened?" Shari cried, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Still clinging to the camera strap, she gaped in surprise at the old man's still body, sprawled on its back on the floor. "I don't know," Greg replied in a breathless whisper. Reluctantly, Greg started back toward Dr. Fredericks. Following close behind, Shari uttered a low cry of horror when she clearly saw the fallen man's face. Eyes bulged out, the mouth open in a twisted circle of terror. The face stared up at them, frozen, dead. Dr. Fredericks was dead. What happened? Shari finally managed to say, swallowing hard, forcing herself to turn away from the ghastly, tortured face. "I think he died of fright," Greg replied, squeezing her shoulder without even realizing it. "Fright," she repeated. "He knew better than anyone what the camera could do," Greg said. "When you snapped his picture, I think it scared him to death. I only wanted to throw him off guard, Shari cried. I only wanted to give us a chance to escape. I didn't think. The picture, Greg interrupted. Let's see the picture. Shari raised the camera. The photo was still half inside it. Greg pulled it out with a trembling hand and held it up so they could both see it. Wow, he exclaimed quietly. Wow. The photo showed Dr. Fredericks lying on the floor, his eyes bulging, his mouth frozen open in horror. The fright that had killed him was there, captured on film, frozen forever on his face. The camera had claimed another victim, this time forever. What do we do now? Shari asked, staring down at the figure sprawled at their feet. First, I am putting this camera back, Greg said, taking it from her and shoving it onto its shelf. He turned the vice handle, and the door to the secret compartment closed. Greg breathed a sigh of relief. Hiding the dreadful camera away made him feel so much better. Now let's go home and call the police, he said. 2 days later, on a cool and bright afternoon, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, the four friends stopped at the curb, leaning on their bikes, staring up at the Kaufman house. Even in full sunlight, the old trees surrounding the house wrapped it in shade. So you didn't tell the police about the camera? Bert asked, staring up at the dark, empty front window. Number they wouldn't believe it, Greg told him. Besides, the camera should stay locked up forever. I hope no one ever finds out about it. We told the police we ran into the house to get out of the rain, Shari added. And we said we started to explore while we waited for the storm to blow over, and we found the body in the basement. What did Spidey die of? Michael asked, still gazing up at the house. The police said it was heart failure, Greg told him. But we know the truth. I can't believe one old camera could do so much evil, Bird said. I believe it, Greg said quietly. Let's get out of here, Michael urged. He raised his sneakers to the pedals and started to roll away. This place really creeps me out. The other three followed, pedaling away in thoughtful silence. They had turned the corner and were heading up the next block when two figures emerged from the back door of the Kaufman house. Joey Ferris and Mickey Ward stepped over the weed, choked lawn and onto the driveway. Those jerks aren't too bright, Joey told his companion. They never even saw us the other day, never saw us watching them through the basement window. Mickey laughed. Yeah, they're jerks. They couldn't hide this camera from us. No way, man, Joey said. He raised the camera and examined it. Take my picture, Mickey demanded. Come on, let's try it out. Yeah, okay. Joey raised the viewfinder to his eye. Say cheese. A click, a flash, a whirring sound. Joey pulled the snapshot from the camera, and both boys eagerly huddled around it, waiting to see what developed.